Okay, everybody, we're going to talk about Chapter 2 this week. This might be a review for some of you just coming out of U.S. history or AP U.S. history. We're going to talk about the consensus among the elites and the founding fathers that we saw when, right after the country started to develop. We're also going to talk a little bit about the development of the Constitution and some of the things that went in there. So we're going to talk about the origins of the Constitution. We're going to talk about a representative form or a Republican form of government. There were compromises and negotiations made during the Constitutional Convention, which we'll talk about. And then we'll talk about the importance of economic stability to the founders and some of the things that might go into the system of checks and balances. So this might be a little bit of a review, but we'll deal with it. So here is the hierarchy that we had during this time. As we could see, elites, and then the educator at the very top, and then the black slaves, and then indentured servants are at the bottom. And we also kind of have a little bit of a middle class there as well, with farmers and shopkeepers and all that. So basically, the Articles of Confederation were developed after this country was born. Basically, it was a treaty among sovereign nations, and it established a firm league of friendship among states that felt that perhaps they should run things like commerce and stuff like that, while the federal government would, in a sense, be responsible for the defense and to protect the states from a foreign incursion. So in the Articles of Confederation, power is delegated to the United States, much like what we have today, the power to declare war, the power to send and receive ambassadors, engaging in treaties with other countries, engaging in diplomacy with other countries, issuing money, post office, borrowing money, and so on, and also, equipping the military. The powers that the state had were commerce, regulating commerce, and levying taxes, and we could see right away those are going to be revenue generators. So obviously the federal government would not have a say in how some of these commerce laws and tax laws would work. So it was a point of contention among people who were, could be considered federalists versus the anti-federalists, which you all know about. So the national elite decided to start, in a sense, revising the Articles of Confederation. There was meetings in Annapolis, Maryland, that sought to outline defects within the Articles. We also saw Shays' Rebellion, which you all probably learned about in history. This exposed government weakness. A group of debtors raided an arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, and then they kind of scared the federal government into kind of the lack of power that they may have had at that time. Congress called for a convention to revise the Articles, but instead they wrote a whole new constitution. At this time we did see a national elite as well. We had George Washington, father of the country, commander-in-chief, one of the richest men in the country. And in turn, we also had the founders whose governing experience, were things like, making key decisions in government, controlling the Congress, fighting and conducting the Revolutionary War, and so on. A lot of the founders were educated in very prestigious institutions such as Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, and so on. This also kind of set the precedent for the fact that a lot of decision makers usually have some type of training in legal decisions and legal aspects. One thing that can help this is that people who are decision makers that have a legal background can understand the law more, but also they might know how to circumvent the law. So that's something to take into account. Founders were very wealthy. Alexander Hamilton was the exception. Alexander Hamilton came from a modest background, but for the most part, the other founders were very, very wealthy. They also had a national point of view, and we don't want to confuse this with nationalism. I mean, it does say nationalism, but nationalism could be a different have a different meaning to people than others. If I hear the word nationalism, I think of the Nazi Party, or maybe in North Korea, where that sense is maybe you are willing to sacrifice your own values in order to have the betterment of the country put forth. I don't want to confuse it with patriotism. Patriotism is a love for your country, but I think nationalism is that love for your country while you give up all your rights and your liberties for the betterment of the country through that view. The founders believed that we needed a strong national government with the power to exercise its will directly on the people. So a very important part, taking power away from the states and moving it to the federal government. Classic liberalism is kind of a thought that John Locke, who had a lot of influence on the founders, kind of promulgated. Classic liberalism is the belief that humans are rational, free, capable for thinking of this for themselves. There's a focus on individual freedoms, civil liberties, a distrust of government, and even going a little bit further, as limited government as possible. And, it's kind of basis of John Locke, where he talks about something called the social contract theory. Now, we're going to look at that a little bit more in the spring. But for the most part, where we talk about social contract, that's the fact that we are going to submit to the government's rule. In exchange, the government has to protect our life, liberty, and property, right? Especially through an independent arbitrator. Classical conservatism is also an ideology that was within, kind of the minds of the founders. Human nature is flawed and prone to weakness, and you need government to be able to mitigate the worst damage humans might be able to inflict on themselves, right? So, common law system, which we'll talk more about when we get into the courts, and trying to have individuals kind of back away from the selfishness they may have, and a focus along that on family, faith in God, education, and government. So when we talk about protecting liberty and property, the founders agreed that the fundamental end of government is the protection of individual liberty, right? We have to understand that we were endowed certain inalienable rights such as life, liberty, and property. Equality is also an important issue. Equality means equality under the law and equality of opportunity. Not so much equality of outcome, which we see on the right side. The founders did not believe in equality in wealth, intelligence, virtue, or talent. But going forward, we're going to take a little bit more of a look on how we kind of evolved into a society that might want to start providing mechanisms where equality of outcome might be more beneficial to our society and some people's opinions. Talked about social contract theory. Also talk about a type of government that has to be formed as far as representation in Congress. And the founders believed that republicanism was the best mechanism or the best type of government to use in our society. A Republican government where we go in and we are divided up in districts throughout the country, and we elect a person to represent us in Washington, D.C. And that person is supposed to be wise, prudent, and able to understand what we want as a citizenry here in the United States. This had to be representative, responsible, and non-hereditary, kind of going away from that divine right of kings that you all might have heard about, where aristocracy or some type of kind of divine right of kings put people in power. We didn't want an aristocracy, we want or mass democracy. Remember, they wanted to limit the amount of how individuals could vote. They expected the masses to consent to government by men of principle and property, and this is not a gender neutral term as we know. It was definitely men, right? White men with property. And there was kind of an agreement where the masses should have only a limited indirect role in government. And when you think about it, that's very, very true, and that's what they did. The only thing that we voted directly for during this time was for House of Representative members. At this time, in addition, senators were elected by state legislators, right? So they decided who they wanted the senators. Now, because of the 17th Amendment, we elect our senators directly. So in California, we vote for our 2 senators as opposed to the state legislature or the assembly and the Senate here in California picking our senators. And also, when we talk about that indirect role, the only thing that we may have an indirect role now is electing president, and that is through the Electoral College, which we'll talk about later. Founders believed in limited government, and that we needed to divide this government into separate entities that would be capable of checking each other. So, that whole kind of that Madisonian 51 thought where if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, and kind of that whole thought that you need government to be balanced and fair and have that neutral arbitrator, that independent arbitrator to resolve any type of conflicts that may be there. And, you guys probably are familiar with the system of checks and balances. Congress passes a law. The executive branch will enforce the law through the bureaucratic part of the executive branch, and the judicial branch is mainly responsible for interpreting laws. Again, we talked a little bit about this. The consensus was radical compared to other beliefs throughout the world. Other governments had hereditary type representatives or leaders or whatever you want to call them. U.S. elites believed in equality and inalienable human right, but again, only for certain people. Now, when the Constitution was being developed, there were a few ideas with regards on how representation should be handled. There is a Virginia plan and a New Jersey plan, and I'm pretty sure you guys may have reviewed this before, but the Virginia plan sought to have a 2-house legislature with the lower house to be chosen by citizens of the state according to population, and upper house chosen by the first house. So this is very comparable to what English Parliament has, right? The English Parliament has the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons chooses the House of Lords. In the Virginia plan, there was also a belief that Congress should have the authority to nullify state laws. And again, proposing a parliamentary form of government where Congress would choose the executive branch and the judiciary branch. The New Jersey plan had a little bit of a different take on this. They wanted to separate out the executive branch and the judiciary branch and have them run independently. They wanted to expand the powers of Congress to take away the right to tax and to regulate commerce away from the states. And they also wanted a one-house legislature, a unicameral house that each had 1 vote per state. So neither plan really appealed to the founders. So we had something called the Connecticut Compromise. And what the Connecticut Compromise was, it created a 2-house legislature, the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and then the Senate, which would be the upper house, which would be equal, 2 senators per state. So 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 members of the Senate. Slavery also needed to be addressed in the Constitution. 3/5 of compromise was put into place. So for the purposes of reputation, the South was concerned that their slaves wouldn't count toward the allocation of seats in Congress, or the proportion of seats in Congress. So the 3/5 compromise was put in place. Now, slaves still didn't have rights. Slaves still were considered property, but they counted for 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation and apportioning direct taxes to that state. Congress also prohibited the slave trade, but not before 1808. And in Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, it guaranteed the return of escaped slaves. Now, trade and commerce also needed to be addressed. Remember, the states were interfering with the development of our national economy, and also Southern planters feared that Congress may impose export taxes. So what the compromise was that articles exported from any state should bear no taxes or duty. Only imports could be taxed by the national government, and that protects U.S. industries against foreign goods. So this is where we get into the concept of tariffs. If we send merchandise, if we develop merchandise here in California and send it to Arizona, we can't put a duty on it, right? But if China sends a box of merchandise into the United States government can institute a tariff, which is a tax on bringing in foreign goods. And what that does is, if that tax is too high, it kind of motivates people to maybe try to produce that product cheaper, and in turn, this protects U.S. industries here. It's also a question on voter qualification. So, voter for qualification, as we're going to look at throughout the course of this semester, is that there's a lot of differing things that happen between states here in the United States when we talk about voter qualifications. Remember, the founders didn't want mass voting. They believed that people weren't smart enough to vote. So, if we look at it, what is the qualifications to vote here in the United States? It is, you have to be over the age of 18 and you have to be a U.S. citizen, right? Other than that, delegates return the question of suffrage to the state legislatures, which means that each individual state can decide about qualifications of voting. Now, the root is U.S. citizen 18 years and over. But then the states are able to determine if they want to take away a person's right to vote, do maybe some disqualifying felony or whatever. And also, obviously, women were not given the right to vote. And in turn, only one branch of the new government, the House of Representatives, were elected by popular vote. Taxation was also a question. Congress was granted the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. An example of an excise tax is maybe something like gasoline. If you look at the pump next time you go fill up, there should be a breakdown, an itemized breakdown that shows you how much of each cent is going to the different governments here, whether it's local, state, or federal. And in turn, with doing this, they were generating revenue streams which enabled the national government to end its dependence on states, so the national economy could grow. They also needed to protect money and credit, right? So Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution is put into place to protect money. They make bankruptcy laws. So if your debts exceed your assets, you can claim bankruptcy, and that goes through a federal judge. Coining money and regulating value, right? That's another one. Issuing money. Having a fixed weight, standards of weights and measures. So a pound in California will be the same as a pound in Louisiana. An ounce in Arizona will be the same as an ounce in Michigan. Punishing counterfeiting, establishing a post office, and protecting copyright and patent laws. Copyright laws, if you watch, maybe an event or a movie at times on TV, there's usually a disclaimer saying that this is copyrighted material and you can't sell it or disseminate it for any type of reason. Patent law, same thing. You have an invention, you have the right to make money off that invention, and nobody can take your idea without compensating you. Also, people started to move out west, as we know, even though there were people already there. A military was also created. Article 1, Section 8, and Article 2 provides centralized diplomatic and military affairs at the national level. We needed to have a strong navy, to protect commerce. There were still piracy was still a real danger on the seas. People being attacked by pirates, and a national army and navy were not so much to protect against invasion as protection and promotion of the government's commercial and territorial ambitions. So definitely we could see this elitism form here. We also needed to protect against revolution. Actually, Federalist 21 referred to Shays' Rebellion. In Article 4, Section 4 guarantees to every state a republican form of government, as well as protection against domestic violence, and that word we've been hearing about since January 6th, insurrection. Also, we need to understand that Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. So laws of Congress supersede laws of the states, and it made it certain that Congress would control interstate commerce, bankruptcy, money, transportation, communications, and military affairs. One thing that is really interesting with this is the 10th Amendment is put into place where basically if Congress doesn't have what is called an enumerated power or a delegated power, the state government and the local governments can pass laws that, as long as they don't conflict with the Constitution or some type of power that the federal government has. Simply said, one thing that really stands out is the marijuana laws, the cannabis laws here in California. So cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, right? But it is legal at the state and local level. So conceivably, if the federal government wanted to, they could go into a dispensary here in California and shut it down and arrest the people for being in violation of federal law. Now, can state and local law enforcement agencies do that? No, as long as the dispensary is in compliance and has a license and all that stuff, they're able to operate. But conceivably, the federal government can come in and shut down every dispensary because cannabis is still a Schedule 1 drug, Schedule 1 narcotic on the controlled substance list here in the United States. Talked about republicanism. People elect only the U.S. House of Representative members to 2-year terms. State legislatures up into the 17th Amendment elected U.S. senators to 6-year terms. We have the Electoral College, and federal judges were appointed by the president to be on the bench for life. Now, I saw the concept of separation of powers, and separation of powers was a safeguard against majoritarianism to protect the minority's interests. Remember, in Federalist 51, Madison talked about the tyranny of the majority, and that the minority's rights have to be protected. And an independent arbitrator is the one to determine whether or not a right is being violated. So each major decision-making body is chosen by a different constituency. We choose the legislative branch. We indirectly choose the president. And even more indirectly, we choose federal judges, Supreme Court justices, because when we elect the president is the one that picks Supreme Court justices that need to be confirmed by people that we put into office in the Senate. So it's kind of an indirect way that we have an influence on the judicial branch, but really not. One of the things that came out of this is the concept of judicial review, right? Marbury versus Madison, which you guys probably are familiar with. What Marbury versus Madison did is the Supreme Court gave themselves the power to invalidate not only state laws and constitutions, but also any laws of Congress that may conflict with the Constitution. And I think out of everything, this is one of the most powerful tools that any entity in our government has, right? The concept of judicial review. Because when you think about it, this has a way to look at how elitism is working in our government, because we have 9 individuals that have an immense amount of power. Remember, the Supreme Court can declare whether or not a law is constitutional or not, and sometimes these laws affect our individual rights. So, the Constitution was eventually ratified and put into place. The Bill of Rights was put into place, the first 10 amendments, and we all have kind of a differencing of opinion on what we believe to be the most important amendments within the Constitution, especially the first 10. The first 10 were passed in 1791, and all of these, those 10 Bill of Rights amendments were put into place to protect individuals from the government. So when you think about it, the First Amendment gives us the power to speak freely, or to have a press, or to assemble. Second Amendment, one of the more controversial amendments, gives the right to bear arms, and that's always subject to a lot of really good discussions on what we perhaps believe that the founders intended with the Second Amendment. Third Amendment, they can't quarter troops in our home during wartime. Don't worry about that. Fourth Amendment is very important. We are subject to the fact that if law enforcement or the government was to come into our house and search, they need some type of warrant under the Fourth Amendment, and probable cause that a crime has been committed needs to be shown as well. We have due process in the Fifth Amendment. We have the right to remain silent. We have the right to confront our accusers. We have the right to be able to have a trial. The Sixth Amendment basically says we all have a right to an attorney in a criminal case. Seventh Amendment establishes that if we have a disagreement with somebody that exceeds $20, we can take them to court, so sue them civilly, right? The Eighth Amendment prevents cruel and unusual punishment, things like the death penalty. The Ninth Amendment, don't worry about. And the 10th Amendment, like I said, we'll talk more about it when we get into federalism, but the 10th Amendment gives people the ability to, or gives states the ability to pass laws as long as they don't conflict with the power that Congress has, or they are not unconstitutional. California Constitution has been amended 480 times. The California Constitution link is attached. And, we have our own constitution here in California, and it just, one thing when we talk about direct democracy, next week I'll show you instances where we as people, not Congress, we as the people can revise the California Constitution. Let's talk a little bit about checks and balances. One of these problems is it can create gridlock, right? And sometimes it's easier to keep things the way they are than to enact new legislation with regards to checks and balances. And here's just some examples I want you guys to look at. Make sure you understand that. And some figures here. Okay, that's what I got for Chapter 2. We'll come back and talk about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is going to focus on elites and how, some of them got into power, and we'll talk about elitism in America in the next class. Okay, talk to you soon.